By 8:23 in the morning, the loading dock at the Whitmore Distribution Center had gone completely silent. Not the normal quiet of an early Tuesday, the kind where you hear forklifts humming in the background and someone 3 bays over arguing about hockey. I mean the kind of silence that happens when a building full of 230 people collectively realizes that nothing is moving, nothing is opening, nothing is responding. I know because my son called me from the parking lot. "Dad," he said, "the whole system's down. Nobody can access anything. The dispatch board is blank. The receiving terminals are locked. The warehouse management software is just sitting there asking for an authorization key that nobody has." I was sitting at my kitchen table in Barrie, Ontario, drinking a second cup of coffee I didn't actually need, watching the sun come up over the backyard. I'd poured it mostly out of habit. 31 years of leaving the house before sunrise will do that to you. The body doesn't know what to do with stillness. I said, "I know." He went quiet for a second. Then, "What do you mean you know?" I told him I'd explain later. I told him not to worry. And I hung up the phone and just sat there, watching the light move across the yard my wife had spent 3 summers trying to get the garden right in. And I thought about a Tuesday morning back in March when I walked into a meeting I wasn't expecting, and a man who wouldn't look me in the eye told me my position had been eliminated, effective immediately, and that security would escort me to my car. 26 days before my pension fully vested. I need to tell you how it started, not the ending, because you're probably already guessing at the ending. I need to tell you how 31 years becomes invisible to the people you built something for, and how a person who spent 3 decades solving problems nobody else could solve eventually has to decide what to do with that knowledge. I started at Whitmore in 1994. I was 29 years old, freshly out of a systems engineering program at Waterloo, and I took the job because they offered me $46,000 a year and a pension plan, and my wife was 4 months pregnant with our son. Whitmore was mid-sized then, maybe 90 employees across 3 facilities in southern Ontario. They moved industrial equipment parts mostly. Bearings, seals, hydraulic fittings. Unglamorous work. Reliable work. My official title when I started was Systems Coordinator, which meant I inherited a filing system held together with literal rubber bands and a warehouse management program running on hardware so old the vendor had stopped supporting it in 1991. My first 6 months, I spent more time on the phone with retired technicians than I did with anyone in the building. But I fixed it, and then I fixed the next thing, and the next. By 2003, Whitmore had tripled, new facilities in Hamilton and Thunder Bay, a distribution contract with 3 provincial hospital networks, a client roster that had grown from 42 accounts to over 300. The COO at the time, a man named Gerald who smoked a pipe in his office like it was still 1972, told me once that Whitmore's entire operational infrastructure ran on what I'd built. He said it like it was a compliment. I understood even then that it was also a warning. The thing about building a system from the ground up, really building it, not just implementing software someone else wrote, is that you make thousands of small decisions that nobody ever documents. You make them at 11 p.m. when a server's failing and you need a workaround that'll hold until morning. You make them when the original vendor's out of business and you have to improvise a bridge between 2 systems that were never designed to talk to each other. You make them over years and the decisions compound, and eventually you have something that works extraordinarily well, but only because one person understands all of it. I try to change that. I want to be clear about that because it matters. In 2009, I wrote a 43-page systems documentation manual and presented it to the operations team. I asked for 2 junior engineers to train under me. The request was denied. Budget concerns, I was told. In 2013, I updated the manual and requested again. Denied. In 2016, after we'd expanded into New Brunswick and the complexity had genuinely become something I worried about, I sent a formal memo directly to the executive team. I have a copy of that memo. I've kept every one of them. The response I got back was 3 sentences. Essentially, "We trust you. You've never let us down. Let's revisit this next fiscal year." We never revisited it. What I didn't put in those memos What I never told anyone directly was that in 2011 I had quietly built something extra into the architecture. Not a bomb, not malware, nothing destructive. I want to be precise about what it was, because people will want to call it sabotage, and it wasn't. I built a verification layer. I called it the Anchor Protocol. Whitmore's entire logistics system, dispatch, receiving, inventory management, client billing, everything ran through a central authorization hub that I'd built and maintained since 2004. The Anchor Protocol was a secondary authentication layer woven into the deepest part of that hub. It ran silently. Nobody knew it was there, and it required periodic reauthorization from a specific credential set that only I held. Every 180 days, the Anchor Protocol would send a silent handshake request to a secure key I maintained off-site. As long as I responded, which I did, automatically through an encrypted process I'd set up, the system ran normally and nobody ever saw it. The whole thing was invisible. Why did I build it? Because in 2011, the new ownership group that had bought Whitmore the previous year had already tried once to outsource my department entirely to a firm in Mississauga. They'd reached out to that firm without telling me. I found out because the firm's project manager accidentally CC'd me on an internal email. The outsourcing didn't happen. The ownership group apparently decided the transition risk was too high. But I understood something in that moment that I hadn't let myself fully accept before. To them, I was a line item. I had given Whitmore 11 years at that point. I had turned down 2 other offers to stay. I had worked through my father's illness and my daughter's wedding, and a period in 2007 when my wife was in the hospital for 6 weeks, and I was running a facility expansion at the same time, sleeping 4 hours a night, and somehow keeping everything moving. I had done all of that because I believed I was building something that mattered, and a place that recognized what I contributed. The CC'd email taught me I was wrong. I'm not asking you to approve of what I did, I'm just telling you why. The Anchor Protocol wasn't revenge, it was insurance. It was the only leverage I had against a version of the future where they decided one day that I was too expensive and showed me the door, and handed my life's work to a consultant who'd never spent a night on the floor of a server room in Hamilton, trying to keep a hospital supply contract alive through a power failure. The years after that were, in most ways, fine. Good even. Whitmore continued to grow. I got promoted twice. My salary by 2018 was sitting at $148,000, and my pension, which vested in full at 31 years of service, was projected at $3.4 million in commuted value by the time I hit my 31st anniversary. I know that number sounds large, but I want you to understand what 31 years looks like. I want you to understand 3 decades of early mornings and late nights and problems solved and systems built, and every vacation I ever took with half my brain still pointed at a server room 1,200 kilometers away. That number was not a windfall. That number was my life converted to dollars. I should have known something was coming when they brought in the new VP of Operations in the autumn of 2024. His name was Bryce. He was 38 years old and he had an MBA from McGill and a way of talking about operational modernization that meant, in practice, replacing anything he didn't immediately understand with something cheaper that he could explain in a slide deck. He took one look at my system's architecture and told me in our first meeting that it was impressively complex but possibly over-engineered for current needs. I nodded. I had learned over 31 years when to nod. But I also watched. Over the following months, I watched Bryce quietly build a case. I saw the external IT consultant he brought in to evaluate infrastructure. I saw the way he started CCing HR on routine operations emails. I noticed when my name stopped appearing on the agenda for the quarterly planning meetings I had attended for 2 decades. I wasn't paranoid, I was paying attention. There's a difference. In January of 2025, I turned 60 years old. My 31st anniversary with Whitmore was March 14th. The full pension vesting date was March 14th. I had circled it in my head for years, not because I was desperate to leave, but because it represented the completion of something. A covenant almost. 31 years, and then a dignified close. On March 11th, A Tuesday, 3 days before that date, I was called into a meeting with Bryce and the HR director. The HR director's name was Simone. She was professional. She kept her eyes on the papers in front of her for most of it. Bryce sat across from me with his hands folded on the table like he was waiting for a bus. They told me my position was being eliminated as part of a strategic restructuring. Effective immediately, I would receive a severance package consistent with Ontario employment standards, which, for someone at my tenure, amounted to a meaningful sum, but not the pension. The pension required the full vesting date, March 14th, 3 days away. I looked at Bryce. "That's final?" I asked. He nodded, didn't meet my eyes. I thought about everything I could have said. I thought about 31 years. I thought about the memo I wrote in 2016 that nobody read. I thought about my son calling me from the loading dock at 6 in the morning when a hydraulic seal shipment had to be rerouted overnight, and I was the only person who knew how to do it. I thought about my daughter's face when I missed the first hour of her rehearsal dinner, because a server in Thunder Bay had gone down, and I was the only one who could fix it remotely. I didn't say any of those things. I said, "I'll need to gather my personal items." They walked me to my office. I took 20 minutes. I took the framed photo of my son on his first day of hockey. I took the coffee mug my wife had given me that said "World's Okayest Engineer" because we both thought it was funny. I took the binder, a heavy dark blue 3-ring binder that I had maintained since 2004, which contained, among other things, the only complete written record of the Anchor Protocol structure. I left the building at 2014 p.m. I did not, at that point, do anything to the Anchor Protocol. I want to be clear about the sequence, because people will assume I triggered something on my way out the door, like some kind of dramatic exit. I didn't. I went home. I sat with my wife at the kitchen table and told her what had happened. She cried. I didn't, not then. I made dinner. I called my daughter. I went to bed. The Anchor Protocol ran on a 180-day cycle. The last reauthorization had been in September 2024. The next one was due in mid-March 2025. March 14th, to be specific. My 31st anniversary, the day my pension would have vested. I had not set it up this way on purpose, or maybe some part of me had, years ago, in a way I'd never let myself consciously think about. I genuinely couldn't tell you, but when the date arrived, the Anchor Protocol sent its handshake request to my off-site key, and there was no response because I was no longer an employee of Whitmore Distribution and my credentials had been revoked the afternoon of March 11th. The Anchor Protocol waited 72 hours for a response as designed. On the morning of March 14th, at 8:23 a.m., the verification layer quietly locked. Everything that ran through the central authorization hub, dispatch, receiving, inventory, billing, client access went into a suspended state, not deleted, not corrupted, just locked behind a credential wall that nobody at Whitmore had the key to. My son was working the early shift. He called me from the parking lot. The next 4 days were by all accounts chaos. Bryce called me within 2 hours. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail that started professionally and deteriorated over the course of 3 minutes into something much less professional. The operations director called. 3 of my former colleagues called, not on behalf of the company, just genuinely confused and a little scared, which I appreciated. Simone from HR called and left a message that was carefully worded in the way that only HR messages from people who have been told to be careful can be. I didn't return any of them. On the second day, they brought in the IT consultants, the same firm Bryce had used for the infrastructure evaluation. They spent 18 hours trying to diagnose what had happened. From what I later heard through people still inside, their conclusion was that the system had encountered a legacy authentication conflict that was deeply embedded in the original architecture and would require extensive reverse engineering to resolve. They quoted a timeline of 6 to 8 weeks, minimum. 6 to 8 weeks, for a distribution company running hospital supply contracts. On the third day, I received a letter through a courier. It was from Whitmore's legal team. It was written in the kind of language that tries to sound both threatening and conciliatory at the same time, which is a difficult combination to pull off, and they didn't entirely manage it. It suggested that I had potentially engaged in conduct that interfered with company operations and that they wished to discuss a resolution. I read it twice. I set it on the kitchen table. I called my employment lawyer, a woman I'd had a relationship with professionally for about 12 years, because I am the kind of person who maintains an employment lawyer the way other people maintain a mechanic, and I read it to her over the phone. She laughed, but only briefly because she is a professional. "Forward it to me," she said. "Don't respond. Don't call them." On the fourth day, Bryce showed up at my house. I'll give him this. He came alone. He didn't bring lawyers or HR. He stood at my front door in a jacket that was too light for the March wind coming off the bay. And when I opened the door, he looked like a man who had not slept properly in 4 days, which he almost certainly hadn't. He said he wanted to talk. I let him in because I was raised in a house where you don't leave people standing in the cold, even people who deserve it. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd heard from my son, where I'd read the legal letter, where my wife had cried, and he told me that the company was in serious trouble. The hospital supply contracts had escalation clauses. 3 clients had already sent formal notices. The Thunder Bay facility was basically non-operational. A shipment of surgical supplies to a network of long-term care homes in northwestern Ontario was delayed by 4 days and counting. "People depend on this," he said. "I know," I said. "I'm the one who built it so they could." He looked at me. I think he wanted to be angry, but he was too tired for it, and maybe somewhere underneath the MBA and the slide decks, he was self-aware enough to know he didn't have standing for it. He said, "What do you need?" And here is the thing about 31 years. Here is what it actually does to a person, which is something the revenge fantasy version of this story always gets wrong. I didn't want to watch the building burn. I never did. I wasn't sitting in my kitchen enjoying it. The thing I'd spent 3 decades of my life building was in trouble. And somewhere in northwestern Ontario there were long-term care residents who might not get what they needed because of a contract dispute between me and a man who'd been at the company for 8 months. That mattered to me. It mattered more than being right. I said, "I want what I was owed, my full pension, calculated to today's date, and I want it acknowledged in writing that my position was eliminated to avoid that obligation." Bryce started to say something about what he could and couldn't authorize. I said, "Call whoever you need to call. I'll wait." He made 3 phone calls from my kitchen table, 2 of them outside on the front step in that too light jacket. The third one, he came back inside and sat down and said that the ownership group was prepared to make an arrangement. Not the full commuted value, but a negotiated settlement structured as a combination of a lump sum and a continuing pension draw. My lawyer would need to review it. I said that was fine. I said I'd have a technical colleague walk their IT team through the reauthorization process remotely. I didn't go back to the building. I didn't want to go back to the building. But I was not going to leave a healthcare supply chain paralyzed over principle, and I think Bryce, to his credit, understood that about me by then. The surgical supplies reached the long-term care homes in northwestern Ontario by Friday. My employment lawyer reviewed the settlement documents over the following 3 weeks. The final number, structured across a lump sum and a 20-year draw, was not the $3.4 million I would have received at full vesting, but it was close enough that she told me to take it, and she doesn't tell people to take things unless she means it. I signed in April. I don't think Bryce survived the incident, professionally. I heard from a former colleague, not through any dramatic channel, just the normal way that information moves when people have worked together for a long time, that he left Whitmore that summer. I don't know the details, and I didn't ask for them. My son still works there. He called me the week after the systems came back online and said the building felt different. He said it in a way that I understood meant something had shifted, not just technically, but in terms of how people talked about the work, about who built what, about what it means when you strip a place of the person who knows where everything actually lives. I told him that was probably a good thing. My wife and I took a trip in June. We went to Cape Breton. We talked about it for years, one of those trips that keeps getting deferred because there's always something more urgent. And we finally just went. We rented a small house near Ingonish for 2 weeks, and I did not bring a laptop, and I did not check my phone for anything work-related because there was no work to check. On the last evening there, we sat on the deck and watched the sun go down over the Atlantic. And she reached over and held my hand and didn't say anything. And I didn't either. And I thought about 31 years and everything they contained. And I let myself finally be done with it. I still have the dark blue binder. It sits on a shelf in my home office next to a photo of the three of us, my wife, my son, and me, taken at Christmas probably 15 years ago, when he was still young enough that I looked tall next to him. I haven't opened the binder in months, but I haven't thrown it away either. Some things you keep, not because you plan to use them, but because they're part of the record. Because somewhere in those pages is 31 years of decisions and workarounds and problems solved and nights spent keeping something alive that was bigger than any single person who worked there. Because the system remembered. And so do I. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened, not the logistics of it, not the legal pieces, but the deeper current running underneath all of it, the part that doesn't fit neatly into a settlement document. Here's what I keep coming back to. Nobody at Whitmore set out to be cruel. I don't think Bryce woke up in the morning wanting to hurt someone. I think he looked at a spreadsheet, saw a number with my name next to it, and made a calculation. That's the thing about institutions. They don't require malice to cause harm. They just require people who stopped asking whether what they're doing is right and started asking only whether it's defensible. I asked myself that question too back in 2011 when I built the Anchor protocol. Was it right? I told myself it was insurance. I told myself it was the only language a certain kind of organization understands, and I still believe that mostly. But I also know that I made that decision alone, quietly, without telling anyone. And that matters. The way we do things when nobody's watching is the truest measure of who we are. I built something that worked. Whether it was something I'm entirely proud of is a separate question, and I've sat with that honestly. What I am proud of is what I didn't do. When Bryce sat at my kitchen table and told me people were going to be affected, that healthcare supplies were delayed, that real consequences were reaching people who had nothing to do with any of it, I didn't hesitate. I didn't use their suffering as leverage. I agreed to help the moment there was a fair arrangement on the table because the part of me that spent 31 years keeping things running for people who needed them isn't something I was willing to turn off just to win an argument. That's the thing about building something carefully over a long time. You can't separate what you built from who you became while building it. The knowledge is inseparable from the values. 31 years of showing up, solving problems, staying when it would have been easier to leave. That doesn't just make you technically capable, it makes you someone. And when the moment came that actually tested who I was, I found out I was still that person, even after everything. I think about my son, calling me from the parking lot that morning. He was scared, not just about his job or the system going down. He was scared in the way you get scared when something you thought was solid turns out not to be. I've seen that look on his face twice in his life. Once when he was 8 and I missed a lot of evenings that year. And once that morning in March. I can't give him back those evenings, but I hope what he saw in the weeks that followed, his father staying calm, acting with some kind of integrity, even when he had every reason not to, gave him something worth keeping. That's all any of us can really hand down. Not money, not titles, not even hard-won settlements. Just the shape of how we handled things when it was genuinely difficult. There's a version of this story where I didn't resolve it, where I held the line entirely, where I let the consequences run. I understand why some people might say that version was justified, but I couldn't live inside it. I'm 60 years old, and I've watched enough things fall apart to know that the satisfaction of being right is cold comfort at 2 in the morning. The binder is still on the shelf. The garden out back is starting to come up again, and I'm learning, slowly, what it means to just be here, without a problem to solve or a system to maintain. It turns out that's a skill too. Maybe the last one worth learning.